Have you ever heard of the Senegalese? Their story is one often left in the margins of our history books. A powerful and poignant chapter of the world wars that deserves to be told. So today, let's pull back the curtain on the incredible, yet tragic, saga of the African soldiers who fought for a world that often refused to see them. The story begins in the 19th century with the expansion of the French colonial empire in Africa. In 1857, Louis Faidherbe, the governor of Senegal, established the first permanent corps of African soldiers. In the French army, he called them the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, which translates to Senegalese riflemen. Well, the name suggested they were all from Senegal. The reality was much broader. These units were recruited from across French West Africa, Central Africa, and even East Africa. They came from dozens of different ethnic groups, spoke countless languages, and practiced various faiths. Yet, under the French flag, they were all grouped under one name: the Senegalese. Initially, these soldiers were used to enforce colonial rule and expand French territory on the African continent. They were instrumental in the so-called pacification campaigns, which were often brutal and violent. The French military leadership saw them as natural warriors, a deeply problematic and racist stereotype that portrayed them as being inherently suited to warfare and less sensitive to its horrors. This dehumanizing view would have devastating consequences when the world plunged into war. When the First World War erupted in 1914, France was desperate for manpower. The Western Front was a meat grinder, consuming lives at an unprecedented rate. Where did France turn? To its colonies. A massive, and often forced, recruitment drive began across Africa. The French politician Blaise Diagne, the first black African elected to the French Chamber of Deputies, played a key role. He promised that enlisting would be a path to French citizenship and greater rights for the colonial subjects. For many, this was a powerful incentive. For others, there was no choice. Village chiefs were given quotas to fill, and young men were conscripted, sometimes literally rounded up from their homes and fields. Hundreds of thousands of men were taken from their families and shipped thousands of miles away to fight a war they had little understanding of, for an empire that had subjugated them. Imagine the shock. These men, many of whom had never left their villages, were suddenly transported from the warm savannas and forests of Africa to the cold, muddy, and terrifying trenches of Europe. They faced not only the enemy's bullets and shells, but also freezing temperatures, strange diseases like pneumonia and frostbite, and profound cultural isolation. They were issued uniforms and equipment ill-suited for the European winter. But despite these immense challenges, the Tirailleurs fought with incredible bravery. They were often used as shock troops, sent first over the top in suicidal charges against fortified German positions. French generals, operating under the racist belief that Africans felt less pain, used them as cannon fodder to break enemy lines, sparing their white troops. The casualty rates were staggering. In notorious battles like the Chemin des Dames, thousands of Tirailleurs perished in a matter of days. Their courage was undeniable, but it came at a horrific cost. They earned a fearsome reputation on the battlefield, but back in the rear, they still faced segregation and discrimination from the very army they were dying for. When the war finally ended in 1918, the promises made to them largely evaporated. Only a small fraction received the French citizenship they were promised. The survivors returned home, many with permanent physical and psychological scars, to find that little had changed. They were still colonial subjects, not equals. Their immense sacrifice had been for a mother country that continued to treat them as second-class citizens. The great tragedy was that their loyalty and bloodshed had not bought them the freedom and respect they had fought for. But the story doesn't end there. Just 2 decades later, the world was at war again. And once again, France called upon its African soldiers. In 1940, as Nazi Germany blitzed through France, the Senegalese Tirailleurs were on the front lines, desperately trying to halt the invasion. They fought with ferocious tenacity. In battles across the French countryside, small units of Tirailleurs often held out against overwhelming German forces, fighting to the last man. The German army, steeped in Nazi racial ideology, viewed these black soldiers with particular contempt. When Tirailleurs were captured, they were often murdered on the spot in brutal massacres, like the one at Chasselet near Lyon, where dozens of captured African soldiers and their white officers were Their resistance was a heroic but ultimately futile attempt to save a collapsing nation. After the fall of France, many Tirailleurs became prisoners of war, enduring horrific conditions in German camps. Others joined the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle, continuing the fight from bases in Africa and participating in the eventual liberation of France. They fought in North Africa, in Italy, and took part in Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France in 19... They marched triumphantly into liberated French towns, hailed as heroes. But once again, victory was bittersweet. In a final, cruel act known as blanchiment, or whitening of the troops, Charles de Gaulle ordered the African soldiers to be replaced by white French soldiers for the final victory parade down the Champs-Élysées in Paris. The men who had fought and died for France's liberation were deemed unsuitable to represent it in its moment of glory. They were disarmed, stripped of their new uniforms, and sent back to holding camps. This brings us to one of the most shameful episodes in this story: the Tirailleurs Massacre. In December 1944, at a military camp in Tirailleurs, Senegal, a group of recently returned former prisoners of war staged a protest. They were demanding the back pay they were owed for their years of service and captivity. The French colonial authorities responded not with negotiation, but with overwhelming force. They opened fire on the unarmed veterans. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, were killed. The men who had survived the battlefields of Europe were murdered by the very army they had served. It was a brutal and definitive statement. Their lives and their service were ultimately disposable. The legacy of the Senegalese tirailleurs is complex and deeply moving. They were victims of a brutal colonial system, used as instruments of empire and then as expendable soldiers in its wars. Yet, they were also agents of their own history. Men of incredible courage, resilience, and dignity who fought in the face of unimaginable adversity. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about colonialism, racism, and the forgotten sacrifices that underpin so much of modern history. They fought for a liberty and equality that was systematically denied to them. It's a reminder that the world we live in was built not just on grand ideals, but also on the blood and sacrifice of countless forgotten people. Remembering the Tirailleurs isn't just about correcting a historical omission. It's about honoring their humanity and acknowledging a debt that can never truly be repaid. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into a crucial, yet often overlooked, part of our shared past. If you found this story as powerful as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.